This lecture is all about plate tectonics. So this week you're going to be covering plate tectonics, earthquakes, and volcanoes. So we're kind of into the meat of the geospheres portion of the course for this particular week, and then that'll kind of spill over into next week as well in terms of looking at rocks and minerals and soil. So again, kind of the geosphere focus part of the course will be this week and next week. So let me hide this. All right, so what we're looking at is plate tectonics. Again, if you have the recommended, not required textbook, this is chapter 4 of that book. So what I want you to do is kind of think about what knowledge you already have about tectonic plates and how the world works in terms of continents moving and things like that. So I want you to think about it. So what do you already know about plate tectonics? And if you had to define what plate tectonics is, let's say you had to describe it to a friend, how would you do that? So it's more just to have you reflect on what you already know about plate tectonics, and then we might add to that knowledge base that you have already. So let's talk a little bit about history. If we look at the 1700s to the 1900s, what map makers noticed is that the coastlines of different continents kind of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And that was kind of one of the earliest indicators that maybe a state like Massachusetts, where it is today, is not where it was in the past. So the best example of that is that you can take Africa, and if you slide Africa over, it can match right up with South America. By smushing all of the different continents together, you can create this giant, or what we call a supercontinent, that's called Pangaea, which we'll talk about in a minute. So after the map maker period, this person, Alfred Wagner, came along. He was a German meteorologist, so he didn't actually study rocks, but he got interested in rocks. He got interested in looking at relationships between continents and where they are, and fossils and things like that. And in the 1920s, he published a book called The Origin of Continents and Oceans. And basically what that book was about was the idea that continents can move. So he basically hypothesized or proposed the idea that where North America is today is not where North America was millions of years ago. So he had a bunch of evidence that he used to make this argument. And he had kind of a sad story, which I'll tell you about here shortly. So he is the one that came up with the idea of Pangaea. So Pangaea is what we call a supercontinent. What a supercontinent means is that all of the continents on Earth were smushed together into one cohesive mass. So Pangaea was hypothesized to be together about 220 million years ago. And then over time, the continents drifted apart and moved apart to the present day arrangement of the continents as we know them today. So that was Alfred Wagner's idea, the idea that continents can drift and move around the globe, and that there used to be a supercontinent called Pangaea. Pangaea split apart, and then the continents moved to their present location on Earth today over that 220 million year period. Just to show you kind of an animation of that, this is a timeline counting down from 250 million years ago to the present day. And what you should notice is that this is just showing us Pangaea. And then we have Pangaea breaking apart. So we have the Atlantic Ocean forming here. Then we'll see that South America and Africa split apart. India over here goes for a ride and smacks into Asia to form the Himalayas. And then it works up to the present day in terms of the present day arrangement of continents. So all of this was proposed again by Alfred Wagner, that the idea that continents can move and drift around the globe. So they are not in locked locations. They're not in fixed locations. They move. So let's talk about the evidence that was in his book. There's a couple pieces of evidence that he came up with for the idea that continents can move and they can drift around the globe. So one piece of evidence is that basically he got all of these fossil samples sent to him from all across the globe. So he got some fossil samples from Africa, he got fossil samples from South America, from India, Antarctica, and Australia. And he matched those fossils and he matched those species. Once he looked at kind of the map and the distribution of those fossils, what he noticed is that there are fossils that are in Africa, and the same exact fossil is also in South America. Or as an example, there's a fossil in Antarctica that can also be found in Australia and found in India. So we know today that those continents are separated by oceans, And if you had an organism like this, um, Lystrosaurus is like kind of a dog-like burrowing organism. For that fossil to have been found on India and Antarctica, the only explanation is that it would have walked there. But in modern times, if those continents are separated, that dog-like burrowing organisms can't walk there, it would have to cross the ocean. So the explanation for the continents being together is that that's why we can find these fossils on multiple continents, because that organism walked from one continent to the next one because they were smushed together as Pangea. Here's just another example of these different organisms that fossils were found for. So we have Glossopteris. This is an ancient tree. That's your green dots here. So those fossils have been found in Australia, Antarctica, India, and Africa. We got our Lystrosaurus again, that's been found on different continents. And we have the Mesosaurus, which is a marine reptile. Fossils of that have been found on different continents. So again, the only explanation for that is that if the continents were together, they could either walk between the continents or the wind could carry it not too long of a distance between those connected continents, and then they split over time. So, in addition to matching fossils, he also got rock samples, and then he got maps basically looking at how mountains kind of line up with each other. So, for rock units themselves, you can go to South America. If you go to the eastern part of South America, you will find the same exact rocks as you would find on Western Africa. So, that's kind of these orange boxes here. When rocks form, they form in very unique environments and they have almost like a characteristic DNA, if you want to think about it that way. So they are very specialized and have very specific properties that correspond to the area that they formed. So the fact that we have these two different rock units that are on different continents today probably implies that those rocks formed when those continents were together during Pangea and then split apart. Same thing for mountains. If you look at the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern US, you'll find the same exact rocks in the Appalachians as if you went up to Greenland, or you went to Scandinavia, or you went to Great Britain, or Africa. And the explanation for that is that when Pangea was together, we had these mountains that formed as those continents collided, as we'll elaborate on later. That formed these mountains, and then it split apart later on. So the fact that rocks match up and mountains match up, that was evidence for continents being together and then drifting or moving after the fact. A slightly different one is called a paleoclimate. So paleo means old or ancient. So we're looking at past climates or past ice ages. There is something that happens if you have a glacier. A glacier is a huge mass of ice that has a lot of weight. It has a lot of density to it, so it's very heavy. It's got a lot of mass. And that glacier moves over rock. And as it does so, it kind of scrapes it and carves it up and forms these grooves that can be traced in terms of looking at the direction that you know the glacier or the ice was moving. So this image here on the left side basically is what are called glacial scratches. The sciencey term for it is called a striation. But these scratches basically are left behind when glaciers move. And the orientation or the direction of those scratches can tell you which way a glacier was moving. So using those scratches, what Alfred Wagner did was line up those scratches and trying to look at what direction a glacier was moving. And on this map here on the right side, these arrows show you the direction that a glacier was moving. So the only explanation for these scratches, basically that glaciers left behind when they were moving, is that the continents were together and then they split up over time. That's kind of the only explanation for the way the scratches look the way they do in rock. So if we summarize that and put it all together, we know that continents move around the Earth. Oceans can open and close, and we'll talk about the mechanism for that in the next lecture. But I said before that basically he had a sad story. He was rejected by the scientific community. All of his ideas were rejected by the scientific community because he wasn't a geologist by training. He didn't study rocks, he studied weather. So he was rejected by the community. He died. And then it wasn't until after the fact that basically people realized he was correct and that his ideas were spot on. And then now we accept them for as science. So the reason that he was rejected is that he knew that continents moved, but he couldn't explain how. So he didn't know the mechanism for continents actually moving. He just knew that they probably had moved in the past, but not how. If we look at the future, there will be in the future another Pangea. So geologists have measured the rates of movement of different continents, and then Pangea Ultima is likely, or one kind of rendering of what the future might look like in terms of a future Pangea. Um, so I apologize, I have a typo on here. So I want you to complete week 2, lecture 1 quiz. There's about half of the questions are corresponding to what I just talked about for continental drift. Once you complete those, you can come back and then keep watching the remainder of this lecture to answer more questions. Okay, so the last thing I want to finish up with is I said that Alfred Wagner was rejected by the scientific community because he couldn't explain how continents moved. So it wasn't until about the 1940s that we finally learned enough about the ocean floor for someone else to come along and make a hypothesis or an explanation about how continents move. So after World War II, basically the knowledge about the ocean increased because there was better technology to be able to survey the ocean floor. And when this ocean floor was surveyed, they discovered there's a lot of features that are underneath of the ocean water, down at the bottom of the ocean floor. But depending on where you are globally, if you start on a beach, and let's say you start walking underwater, down underneath of the water in the ocean, you're going to be walking on something called the continental shelf. So if you walk from the beach, if you're able to see my mouse here, if you walk on the beach and you go down and you're walking along the bottom of the ocean floor, you're going to be walking on something called the continental shelf, which is just a very gentle slope off the edge of the continent until the water gets about 500 feet deep or so. A good analogy for this is kind of like the shallow end of a pool. So if you've been in a pool that has the shallow end and the deep end, this is basically like walking on the shallow end of a pool. So once you keep walking from the beach, you cross over the continental shelf, you'll reach a slope basically where it will drop down, just like you would have if you go to the deep end of a pool. And then it will flatten out into something called the abyssal plain. So the abyssal plain is about 2.5 miles below sea level. For right now, we'll say that it's a pretty featureless area, so there's not a lot of stuff going down on the abyssal plain. But you would reach the abyssal plain at the bottom, about 2.5 miles deep beneath the surface. Let's say you keep walking across the ocean floor. So you go past the continental shelf. Let's say you were walking from Massachusetts up here. You would go on the continental shelf, which is this light blue color. You have the abyssal plain. That's the darker blue color because it's deeper. And halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, you're going to reach something called the oceanic ridge. So an ocean ridge is an area that is shallower than everything else around it. So you'd be walking along on the ocean floor, and then you got to go up and over a feature in the center of the ocean. So that feature is called a ridge. It might help you to think about it as like an underwater hill or an underwater mountain range. So basically, if you were walking along, you'd have to go up one side and then back down the other side. Okay, so that's an ocean ridge. So we just have one more feature to talk about, and that's a trench. So there's not one in every single ocean, but there are trenches that are globally prevalent, especially in the Pacific Ocean. So an ocean trench is a narrow, deep valley that is down at the bottom of the ocean. And it's typically a V-shaped valley that can be up to 7 miles deep, depending on the trench. Just to give you a visual, this is more for a shallow environment, so there wouldn't be any light down in the bottom of a trench because the sun can't penetrate that deep. But this kind of gives you like a visual of what it might look like. So very narrow and very tall walls on the sides of it. So a trench tends to have a V shape. So on this figure on the bottom right, basically this has a V shape. It's a very deep underwater valley. So valley, V shape, trench, if that helps you out. And then we have a map here. Basically the purple colors are showing you an area where there's a trench. Again, a deep underwater canyon or valley at the bottom of the ocean floor. All right, so just to show you a couple of maps in terms of the features that I'm talking about. So there's ridges all around the globe, the ones that you would go up and over. Anything in pink on here is a ridge. So you would hike up and over that feature. And then anything in red on this map on the bottom is somewhere that you would be walking along and then you fall down into the abyss and then come back up on the other side on this V-shaped underwater valley. All right, and then just as kind of a a introduction to the rest of the quiz questions that you'll have. You're going to be looking at 4 maps. You're going to have a map of the ocean floor in terms of the age of the ocean floor. You're going to look at a map of earthquakes, a map of volcanoes, and then a map of the topography. So like how much above sea level is a certain feature or how much below sea level a certain feature is. So anyway, so you should be able to finish up your remainder of your quiz questions at this point.